Let me thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you for coming this evening to listen to a lecture in English and braving the weather and the rain. I was just telling people in Palestine we're very happy when it rains. We need more. We think it's a good omen. It's plenty. There are so many people I wish to thank for this honor and for all the efforts that they made in bringing me here. If I make mistakes in pronouncing names, Mr. President, Director of the University, Prof.Dr. Lothar Zichlen, that's okay? Okay. And so many people who have been just wonderful, with the Scarlett Brune-Waver, and Sabine Six, and Beate Kostka. I'm practicing. And of course, I'm Dr. Jochen Hippler, who will be taking the questions and answers and, moderating the discussion. It is indeed an honor for me to be awarded this professorship, and I'm deeply grateful, and I feel privileged and humbled also by your warm welcome and reception. As stated in the introduction, today, actually this month and this year, are significant dates. November 29th, 1947, 60 years ago, the partition of Palestine took place. UN Resolution 181 was adopted. 56% of Palestine was given to create the State of Israel, 44% for the Palestinians, and later this date was adopted by the UN as the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. So I'm grateful for your solidarity and for being here today. Now, again, November frames another event which Professor mentioned, November 27th, 2007. 2 days ago at Annapolis, yet another international or multilateral meeting or conference took place to attempt yet another resolution. So have we come really full circle? Has the partition of Palestine finally taken hold, and are we going to see the two-state solution as a result of what happened 2 days ago in Annapolis and the talks that were launched yesterday, actually, in the States? Have we come full circle? That's a question I would like to address. Now, the Palestinian chronology, I'm going to give you just a very brief summary of what's important in the month of November, primarily in Palestinian chronology. I don't expect you to remember all the dates, and you're not going to be quizzed on them. So, to give you an idea, 90 years ago, November 2nd, 1917, I don't know how many of you are aware of the Balfour Declaration, in which Palestine was pledged to create a homeland for the Jews, and that began a process of injustice and denial for the Palestinian people. And I will explain that later. And of course, 60 years ago, November 29, partition. 40 years ago, there's an exception, because June 5th, 1967, Israel occupied the rest of Palestine, the West Bank, including Jerusalem and Gaza. But on November 22nd, 1967, the UN adopted Resolution 242 that has become the basis of all subsequent talks on Palestine. 242 talking about first the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war, and then asking for the return of the territory that Israel occupied in 1967. 30 years ago, November 19, 1977, Egyptian President Sadat visited Israel and again laid the foundations of the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement, defining the framework at the same time for a Palestinian-Israeli settlement at the Camp David, which is called the Camp David approach. 19 years ago, November 15, 1988, was again a significant date for the Palestinians, in which the Palestine National Council, which is our parliament in exile, issued a declaration of independence in which we recognized 181 and 242 and the partition of Palestine and again laid down the foundations and principles of Palestinian statehood, the principles that should govern the nascent Palestinian state. This was a historical date for all of us, and November 15th became associated with the Independence Day of Palestine, even though we're still not independent. 16 years ago, the first week of November 1991, we began the bilateral talks in Madrid following the opening of the Madrid conference on October 31st. And that was the beginning of the legitimization of the language of peace that led, indirectly perhaps, to the Oslo Accords that were signed in September 93. 3 years ago, November 11, 2004, President Yasser Arafat passed away. Most of us believe that he was assassinated. That ended an era in Palestinian history, an era in which you had a national symbolic figure that framed and formed actually the address of Palestinian resistance and the national struggle or the cause. Now, given all these dates in between, it seems like the Palestinian narrative has always been one of trauma, one of pain, one of dispossession, destruction, denial, and dispersion. Yet at the same time, it remains a remarkable tribute to the versatility, endurance, and generosity of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity and injustice. We still have a deep, abiding commitment to a negotiated settlement, to a peaceful resolution, and of course to a rule of law and building a Palestinian state that is based on respect for human rights and human dignity. Now, from the beginning, as a people, we were slated for what we call national obliteration, cast outside the course of history. We became the victims of a myth, and I'm sure you've heard this myth, of a land without a people for a people without a land. So this statement, this myth, somehow dismissed our very existence as though our land was empty. And this type of negation, exclusion, and denial, in a sense, started us on the process of the victimization, and we became victims of the victims, as a friend of mine says. So we were cast into a tunnel of double vision along with double standards, whether moral standards or legal standards, to assuage the guilt of the West, to solve the Jewish problem, and not to compound the guilt. There was a systematic process from the beginning of devaluation of Palestinian rights and dehumanization of Palestinian lives. And that began the process whereby Israel became a country above the law and Palestine a country deprived, or a nation deprived, of the protection of the law. We became the absent people. Our land without a people. Later we were subject to a myth of Israel making the desert bloom, as though Palestine was a desert, which it never was, and that if you can make the desert bloom, then you can lay claim to it, which is no claim to sovereignty. Now, our voices were silenced, our land maligned, and our narrative erased, and later distorted. To reassert this narrative and reaffirm our humanity, and to reclaim our rights and legitimacy, these became the central driving force of the Palestinian national movement, along with the liberation of our land and our people. And the deep abiding principle underlying the struggle has always been the affirmation of the integrity of our identity, not just as people who exist, not just as people who have a history and a culture, but as a people who have a genuine identity that has to be translated into self-determination and freedom. So we engaged in a perpetual quest for historical validation. Now, the dispossession and dispersion and exile of 1948, the war of 1948, led to a refugee question, and I'll talk about this later, that was augmented in 1967 with occupation, oppression, and subjugation of the whole nation. Thus, we suffered from the dual injustice of dispossession and exile on the one hand, and oppression and occupation on the other. And the narrative of victimization became dominant, and it came into direct confrontation with the Israeli claim to victimization. It was a confrontation and a competition. Of course, we always said that there was no monopoly on pain and no one-upmanship on suffering, that one people's victimization does not give them the excuse to victimize others, and that one's sense of victimization and pain does not give you license to do unto others what was done unto you. And this is something we have to deal with personally. The clash of mutually exclusive narratives began there. The creation of the State of Israel represented to the Palestinians a grave historical injustice. We call it a Nakba, a catastrophe, and not a glorious war of liberation or biblical return, as is presented in traditional Zionist literature. The Palestinian refugees' right of return became a basic component or motif of the Palestinian narrative, both with nostalgia and yearning on the one hand, but also as one of the fundamentals of the cause, and therefore fundamental keys to the solution of the problem, with political, legal, and human ramifications and dimensions. Since 1948, the refugee population grew from around 750,000–800,000 to more than 5 million Palestinian refugees. They became the largest refugee population and the longest-standing refugee question in modern history. And if you ask any Palestinian, we're tired of being, victims of superlatives. We just want to be ordinary. We don't want to be superlative in any way. The issue was moved to permanent status negotiations, the question of the refugees, during the Oslo process and the Declaration of Principles, and it became a point of contention in the public discourse on both sides. The Israeli version for a long time claimed that the refugees left of their own free will, or at the invitation or request or behest of the Arab countries and leadership. Only with the new historians, people like Benny Morris and Tom Segev, but of course more importantly Avi Schleim and Ilan Pape, people of courage and wisdom, did the truth begin to emerge, the true narrative of 1948 and what happened to the Palestinians. They investigated the intelligence archives, and they wrote accounts of deliberate intimidation, a series of massacres, mass evictions by force, forced collective expulsion, the total eradication of over 500 villages in Palestine. These all led to the refugee question. It wasn't a matter of will that the Palestinians woke up and decided to flee or to listen to the Arab leadership. Their narrative, as described very amply by Ilan Pape's book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, set the record straight, but still failed to frame Israeli policy, particularly in negotiations. It did not influence the ways in which the refugee question was being dealt with. And the 1948 displacement and replacement paradigm, you displace people and replace them with others, extended to the narrative and to the apocrypha as well, that there was one narrative attempting to displace and replace the other. And that's why people like Ilan Pape and others were trying to regain the integrity, not just of the Palestinian narrative, but actually of the historical narrative of what happened. All Israeli governments that engaged in negotiations, and I've been involved in all of them, insisted on denying the right of return. And UN Resolution 194 that guaranteed the Palestinian refugees right of return and/or compensation, and used the issue of the refugees as a test of legitimacy and a qualifier, a test of qualification for any Palestinian interlocutor. Now, any Palestinian who adhered to the right of return or even mentioned UN Resolution 194 was immediately disqualified. His or her motives were rendered suspect. And we were described, or anybody was described, as an extremist seeking the destruction of the State of Israel by demographic means. That is, if you insist on the right of return of the refugees, then you are insisting on taking over Israel by bringing back an influx of non-Jewish citizens or Palestinians.